contact the dive rescue team. Possible homicide. Human skeletal remains. Columbia Park near the golf course.
County 60 dispatch. Can you confirm a possible homicide, Columbia Park, on the Columbia River?
July 1996, Kennewick, USA. A skull is found by the Columbia River, but this was to be no ordinary homicide. With the find on board, the coroner visits the site with his deputy, Jim Chatters, forensic anthropologist.
The Kennewick Man case began like any other forensic case. It was one of those really wonderful evenings. It had been really hot all day. It had been 108 degrees. The skull looked immediately European-like. It was long, narrow, very constricted behind the eyes, with an extremely prominent nose. Pulled him to shore, got out, and then walked along to where the flags had been laid. And then I turned away from the bank and looked at the water, and there were bones strewn just below the surface.
Dr. Chatters found most of the skeleton torn from the bank by erosion. Stained with time, it was far too old to be a recent homicide.
I got a look at the pelvis and was clearly a man. I immediately got the impression I was dealing with a European, probably an early Kennewick pioneer. I had no idea where the story was going to go at that point, other than thinking I was going to have rather enjoyable puzzles to solve. I did descriptions of some of the bones and some of the injuries to the bones, and I was able to get a cast of the skull. The bridge of the nose is very prominent. The skull itself is quite narrow, really rises to the back, a kind I had only seen among peoples of Western Eurasia.
Because of the controversy that was to engulf him later, Jim Chatters no longer has the real bones, just a few casts, plus some measurements and the video he took of a skeleton that looked European.
He's quite tall. He's about 5'9" tall. He had very long limbs. His lower limb segments, that is, his forearm and his lower leg, were quite long compared to the upper, and American Indians tend to be quite the opposite. They're short-limbed. Kennewick Man had been through a great deal in his life. Injured repeatedly. He broke many of his ribs. He'd broken a foot, he'd broken an elbow, he had an injured hip. He had fused bones in his neck. This man was a bundle of pain. There were some strange parallels here that started getting a bit eerie. Here's a man my age. He's in his late 40s. He'd broken many of his ribs. In fact, he and I had broken exactly the same number of ribs. He had a bad hip. I have a bad hip. So between the two things, it was feeling a bit strange to be working with someone who was so much like me in so many ways.
Chatters still assumed Kennewick Man couldn't be over 200 years old, as no European was supposed to have got to Northwest America before the 19th century. And so far, nothing suggested that Kennewick Man was about to rewrite American history. The amount of carbon in his bones indicated he ate a lot of fish during his troubled life. Before his corpse was washed into the bank, it may have been savaged by dogs, hence missing bones in the chest and nose. Like many white pioneers in the 19th century, he probably died without burial. But something didn't add up.
I was cleaning parts of the pelvis off and observed a gray object inside one of the pelvis bones. I couldn't see enough of it. It was covered with soil, it was packed in with soil. And eventually CAT scans showed it to be a stone spear point. Now, this isn't just any Stone Age point either. These began to show up around 9,000 years ago, but they tend to drop out around 5,000 years. So we've got this paradox. Stone Age object, European man.
Though the wound had healed, there were signs of infection that could have hastened death. But when did all this happen? The bones in a box, Chatters set off that August on a long journey north to Ellensburg to get a second opinion from a leading forensic anthropologist. But already, his every move was being watched by local Indian tribes who believed that if the bones were ancient, they belonged to them. The Columbia River runs through Washington State, northwest America. If the bones were Indian, tribes in the Kennewick region could demand their return for reburial at secret locations. Many Indians believe they are the first Americans, here since time began, living and dying by the Columbia. So if bones are old, they must be Indian.
Since the beginning of time, our elders have told us the history of this land, the importance of this water, the Columbia River, the Snake River, the tributaries. All those are like a vein of blood to our people. To this day, we still go by those laws of thousands of years ago. My heart is saddened when I hear that another one of my elders has been found and dug up. We keep telling people, don't disturb or bother our relatives, because right now they're not at rest.
Early accounts say that just about every island in through here was a scene of hundreds and hundreds of skeletons. I think the deep theological meaning is that souls do continue after death, and therefore they shouldn't be isolated souls. And so you bring them to an island where there are the remains of other human beings, and there's kind of a spirit community there. So those beliefs and practices are held very strongly by tribes in this area. My own tribe, Standing Rock Sioux, we have special beliefs about the dead, and we have sacred places on the reservation. You can talk to some elders, and they say some of these islands have strange lights at night. And this indicates the spirits coming and going. So they're very serious about what happens at death and how you take care of the people who've departed. That's why the skeleton found in the river has become such a high priority.
Local Indian tribes were as keen as Jim Chatters to find out who the mystery man was. Till recently, scientists agreed that the Indians were the first people in America. No Europeans before Columbus. Any Stone Age man had to be Indian. So how old was Kennewick Man? And was he Indian? At Ellensburg University that August, Chatters would get a second opinion.
Dr. Chatters called me because I'm a forensic anthropologist. And one of the things forensic anthropologists do is when the police bring them bones or something like this, they have to tell the police or the sheriff's office or whatever, this is male, female, Caucasoid, Indian, Negroid, or whatever, as best they can. And it depends on what kind of bones you find, of course. So the skull is one of the very best indicators of any racial affiliation. I don't believe that this fellow could have been an Indian. Take the teeth, for instance. They were not American Indian teeth. The shape of the person's orbits, where their eyes sit, that too, not Indian. The width of the cheekbones, not Indian. The size or the length, the breadth of the head, not Indian. Then Jim handed me the pelvis with a projectile point embedded in it. Obviously, the fellow was shot in the rear end, and I recognized the fact that it was very, very old, because that was a very old projectile point. And I looked at it, and I looked at Jim, and I said, well, how can this be? And you're thinking, how can a white person be present that many years ago? How did he get here? Where are some of the rest of these folks, did he come by himself? How did he get here? I couldn't believe this.
With Katie's second opinion, here we have the paradox solidified. We've got this Stone Age object in what would seem to be someone who should only arrive 100 to 200 years ago. Something's wrong here. We were both agreed that this has to be solved in a higher tech way. I needed to get an age estimate on this bone. The only means to do that is to destroy some of the bone through radiocarbon dating. Some of the Indian tribes don't like that done. So if we do it, I'm going to have problems. I'll be criticized heavily for doing it. On the other hand, you can't identify an individual without studying him. Our only method for doing that was to run those tests.
Chatters sent samples of Kennewick fingerbone for radiocarbon dating and DNA analysis by some of America's most eminent scientists. Geneticists at Davis, Northern California, have helped pioneer DNA extraction from ancient bone and were keen to test Kennewick Man. But there's a drawback.
It's quite destructive. The residue is unrecognizable as bone. We essentially grind the bone. The most effective method we find is to use a coffee bean grinder.
Indians are against all this destructive testing. DNA is certainly a destructive testing. And that's because we believe that the skeleton must remain whole. The spirit is attached to the skeleton or can come back to the skeleton.
We have 12.5 samples that we refer to as the ancient ones because they are collectively the oldest samples from Native America. Native Americans have by orthodoxy been regarded as Asiatic in origin. Kennewick opens up the opportunity or the likelihood, the possibility that this is not the entire picture, that there have been at least one additional migration from Europe.
Chatters waited anxiously for the test results. They'd provide foolproof checks on the origin and age of Kennewick Man. Late that August, he got a call from the radiocarbon dating lab. It gave him the shock of his life.
Are you sitting down? Was the first question. Or are you ready for this? And she says, it's 8,400 years old. That's 8,400 radiocarbon years old. Makes it over 9,000 in real years. I had thought it possible, because he was so different looking, that he could be very old, but I didn't expect that. I thought, I'm not that lucky. 150 years to 200 years would make him an early settler. That's exciting enough. That's as far as my luck extends. So I thought we were going to have, that's the age I expected. Here it comes back, it's 9,000 years. Oh my God, this is going to get complicated.
Kennewick Man was one of the oldest Americans ever found. Was he from a vanished race of ancient Europeans? Were they here before the American Indians? 9,000 years after his death, he was posing explosive questions. But forces who didn't want them answered were getting ready for action. At the Smithsonian Museum, Washington, Doug Owsley is a forensic specialist, often hired by the FBI for high-profile murder cases. As an anthropologist, he's trying to build a database comparing ancient and modern American skulls. He wanted Kennewick Man flown to Washington so he could study him.
I was first contacted in the fall of 1996 by Dr. Chatters as a representative of the coroner, and he explained that they had an extremely important discovery that was well preserved, and the skeleton showed features that were very different from what he was used to seeing.
This tied in with Owsley's detailed findings that some early American skulls have many features that just don't look Indian.
When you're talking about skeletons from the time of Kennewick Man, those are extremely rare. But people have begun to systematically examine skeletons and remains that date to that time period. When you start looking at their features, when you start looking at their morphology, one of the things that you see is that they show features that are quite different from modern-day Native American people.
This finding challenges the widely held Indian belief that they were the first people in ancient America, and it confirms the suspicion of many Indians that American archaeology is as tainted with racism now as it was when it began in the last century.
Exploitations of natives, and particularly native skeletons, has been at the basis of archaeology from the beginning. And for a while, an Indian skull was worth $60 in the East, and people used to go through graveyards and cut off these heads. And there's stories about soldiers actually killing Indians and decapitating them, sending the heads in. So that was how the science was built. So that finally, in the late 80s and in 1990, federal legislation said you have to consult with tribes, and if a skeleton is identifiable in the culture area, you have to let them bury it.
The new law gives Native Americans the right to claim human remains for instant reburial. It's already been used to rebury other ancient remains at secret locations. The site where Kennewick Man was found is owned by the US Army's Corps of Engineers. This made them his legal custodians. Together, the Army and the Indians now brought the full force of the law to bear on the scientists. Five Indian tribes demanded the army secure the return of the Ancient One, as they called him, for reburial. Army lawyers then ordered the coroner to impound the bones for safekeeping. Late in August 1996, he visited Jim Chatters with the deputy sheriff.
As I'm packing the bones away, there's this overwhelming sense of loss. I packed each one gently in a plastic bag so that they wouldn't crush each other. And that's all I was able to do. It was like someone I knew well was ill, and I couldn't do a thing to stop it. Their inevitable death. These bones were going to go into Indian hands and be reburied as soon as possible. They were going to be lost to science. They were going to be lost to humanity forever.
Under police guard, Kennewick Man never flew to the Smithsonian. Outraged, Doug Owsley wrote to the US Army and the Indian tribes. His letters were rebuffed or ignored. As an increasing number of ancient bones are being lost to science through reburial, he and 7 other top scientists made their stand with Kennewick Man, filing their own claim to the bones that never arrived.
If we lose this case, then that will set the standard for what happens in the future. And if we lose, then that essentially means that when discoveries are found, there will not be the opportunity to examine those skeletons to find out what they really represent. We have to win in the sense that we're standing up for the American public, for the right to examine these skeletons and to learn from them. I consider Kennewick Man a teacher for all ages, and I want to be free to learn from him. If that isn't possible, then I think that that's the ultimate denial of his place in history.
For the time being, at least, science had lost out. The strong arm of the law put Kennewick Man under lock and key. At the behest of the Indians, all further testing was outlawed.
There is a fear among the tribes that they don't really know who this gentleman is. And if it should turn out to be a spirit that they would get on the wrong side of, then that would bring a lot of misfortune on the people. So that's why a lot of tribes here are very aggressive about this skeleton. See?
There was to be no second test to double-check Kennewick Man's radiocarbon date, and no further testing to establish whether or not he had European DNA.
We were told not only to stop, but to return the material and all the documents, the gels, all the writing that we had that documented what we had done. We were told no longer belonged to us, but belonged to the government. The Kennewick DNA samples were placed within small tubes called Eppendorf tubes, flame sealed, so that it would be clear if they had been tampered with. And then we placed the plastic tubes inside a larger plastic tube and superglued the top of that tube shut.
For the last 2 years, the finger bone samples have stayed locked in David Glenn Smith's safe in California, but he's forbidden by law to analyze them.
We're in limbo right now. We're simply waiting until, hopefully, the court tells us how to proceed, or until someone comes to pick up the bone.
And when you look over here, right there, you see the little tiny serrations at the edge of the cascade point.
All Chatters had left was his casts of the skull and a few bones, plus a hastily shot video. As rumours spread of a prehistoric white American, other claims to Kennewick Man followed. including an unexpected one from another tribe.
May Odin himself speak to you. May he move in your dreams. May he open the doorways between this world and the next one, that wisdom come out. May Odin bring you mighty dreams, dreams of our kin, dreams of ancient times, dreams of the one whom we serve, the messenger in the past.
I am a Gothi, which translates roughly as a priest or a leader in the Alsatru religion. And Alsatru is the revival of a traditional native European religion that was practiced in Northern Europe long ago. Our interest in Kennewick Man revolves largely around the conviction that he is related to us, that in fact this is an individual who, although he obviously doesn't have recent roots, shall we say, in Europe, does ultimately have roots there, and thus is a kinsman of ours, someone that we have a particular obligation to. As soon as we learned that, A, it seems as though this individual may well be related to early Europeans, and B, that they were going to give the remains to the Indians, who, with all due respect, in my opinion, probably are not directly related in the sense that I think we may well be, we filed our own suit in federal court to keep this from happening. The far-traveling one, as some of us call him, has a message for us. I don't know what that message is. Let's find out the truth. That's really what we want to get at.
When you're doing a forensic study of anyone, particularly for a long time, they actually become a person to you. And there was a need to sort of reconnect with that person.
The cast of the skull was a precise replica that would have satisfied any court. Jim Chatters now used it to see what Kennewick Man had looked like. He was helped by a sculptor, Tom McClelland.
We're doing a layering process right up to the finish of skinning him out and making him a fleshed out individual. We're not really creating a person here. We're watching a person come from the bone, from the skull to the flesh. The structure of the bone, the structure of the muscle tissues, every structural layer we add determines what that individual looks like.
It's amazing how much you can tell from the bone. There are little roughened, raised areas here that are the attachment points for the muscle that raises the round part of the chin. And among other things, these muscles are used when we grimace in pain, and this man went through a great deal of pain, so this is consistent with what we know about his history. We're also at this point putting the nose together and positioning it, and the standard for the nose, we're not absolutely sure the standard is correct, but it's the one that's used in facial reconstruction, and that is that the length of the subnasal spine, which is this little projection here, is 1/4 the length of the whole nose. So from its base in there to the end of the nose, in this case would be 48 millimeters, which would put the nose way out in here. So we put a clay mimic in there for the nose, and we see the projection of it. It's a very large nose. There's no getting away from that. That support it has underneath is substantial. It's definitely holding up something of significant proportions. The size of his nose, the shape of his nose, the very prominent high bridge and projection of his nose is more typical of peoples of Western Eurasia, many of whom are referred to as Caucasoid peoples.
What you have in the history of archaeology is one crazy theory after another, which is disproved by later generations, but does considerable harm in the generation in which it's perpetrated. What Chatters is doing is bringing back the ideas of Samuel Morton, that you can go measure skulls and tell what race they are and how intelligent they are. And this degenerated by 1840 into this idea you feel the bumps on a human head and that tells you what their moral content is. The whole thing is just crazy. It's a throwback of 150 years.
Ever since the find, Chatters had in fact tried to apply the most up-to-date objective methods he could to avoid racial bias. The reconstruction of the head followed the strict forensic criteria